Hey guys, welcome back to episode 5 of Help I'm a Camera Nerd. Today we're going to be talking about post-production. It's been a really long journey, I think for both of us, right? I started editing in like 2004, I think, 2003. So yeah, it's kind of been a weird journey that's almost come full circle. But but yeah, tell me about how did you start? When did you start? What did you start on?
So, starting editing was a really interesting one where really it was a case of back at college. I don't even remember what we were using. It was I think iMovie we were working on back in college, and this is like 2005, 2006. So we didn't really have access to much of it. And then going to university and going to Final Cut Pro. Before I go into my journey, Mark, look, I edit, but you're more of the editor of the two of us, and I know you've had a really interesting journey about it too. So before I talk mine, I want to hear yours. So
Okay.
Mark, tell me a little bit about how you started editing, when you got into editing. How was that process, and yeah, and how has it changed over time?
So, 2000 and I think it was 2004 it would have been. And back then it was I started on Adobe Premiere and I don't remember which version, but it was pre Adobe 5 or something like that, I think. And it was when I first started editing, it was at college, similar to you. So, yeah, I didn't have the editing program, but it was like at college, you learn, you shoot stuff, you edit together sequences and stuff like that. And it was a lot more complicated back then, frame rates and stuff like that, and the footage. I remember when I started editing, we shot on tape, so you would do log and capture, I think it was called back then, where you would note down all of your time codes, like the in and the out point of your time codes, and you would basically line them up so that the edit would go and it would just basically record all of those clips. So it was like took you like a decent amount of time to get all the footage into the edit. It wasn't as quick as just dragging and dropping. It was probably a day of just logging and capturing. Um, so that was Adobe Premiere, and then when we went to uni, you were there, and we started working on Final Cut. That was my first like go with Apple. I'd never touched an Apple Mac before. I was on PC. We didn't have Apple at college or anything like that. So got to uni and they had Final Cut 7, was it? Final Cut 7, right?
Yeah, yeah, they had Final Cut 7 back at uni. I mean, I was similar because when I was at college, I in fact I lied about college. We first started editing back in high school. I was in a media studies class with Mrs. Barnes. I don't know where Mrs. Barnes is today. I need to find her. So people listening, if you know where Mrs. Barnes, that was at Bircheshead High School in 2004, 5. Please let me know so I can say hi to her and say, hey, I make films now. Anyways, um, I, it was, I don't even remember what program we did at college, at high school. I remember one of the teachers actually doing most of the editing for us. We were just like, oh, try that there. But then in college, we moved to iMovie, and that was obviously an incredibly restrictive program, but we didn't know at the time. It was like, whoa, this thing allows us to do that. And then, we go to Staffs University, and, one of the things about the media production course that was called then, it's called film production now. And, they have, one of the highlights of it, are one of the key selling points is like, look, we use industry standard programs. And so having that industry standard, a Final Cut Pro 7 as it was at the time, it was like, whoa, we could do so much. And I remember us, and I'm sure a lot of the viewers at UNC University remember Richard Allen's tutorials that we had in the edit suite. Oh man, with the sound from American Beauty, teaching us like how to put sounds together, and had that scene like of I forget the actor's name, but you people are going to hell, and he was talking about
Yeah.
stuff, and we had that, and then the lizard, and then like the lizard moving like little National History Unit type footage. So yeah, it was really exciting. Final Cut Pro. You felt like, oh, we could do so much now. But in hindsight, you look back and actually Final Cut's fairly restrictive. But yeah.
I mean, yeah, you're right. I remember my like open day at uni and going to like arriving and everyone was in one of the edit rooms watching like the films. They would show the students films while they were waiting for the interviews. And then I went in and I had my interview with Dan Hopkins, and I think I'd got there a little bit late, so I asked Dan. I was like, "Can I have a look around?" And he gave me a little tour around the media center, and it was really impressive to me at the time because I was coming from like college that had pretty standard kit, small little tiny room where that kit was kept, but to like go to the media center and see all this kit that you had to book out and go through these processes and stuff, and just seeing an edit room that was like filled with probably like 25 Macs, right, just lined up wherever, and that was just one of the rooms. There were like 2 rooms, and then individual rooms as well that you could use when you moved, you got further into the course and stuff. So it was like, yeah, it was kind of scary at the time, but also really exciting because it was like, yeah, I wanted to use Macs. I knew that a lot of people in the industry were using Macs, and I'm quite a technical person, so to not have that experience on something, I was like, I feel like I'm being held back. So it was one of my big reasons for choosing Staffs, was that they had like great equipment, great editing equipment, great shooting equipment, and Final Cut 7 really became my standard. I remember buying a license for Final Cut 7 in maybe second year, and buying my first Mac as well. I remember second year again, like going into the Apple store. I'd sold a bunch of stuff. I had this cash money on me, and just kind of like getting and pressing that button and hearing that boom, and just being like, I've got myself a machine that I can actually, a laptop that I can edit on. This is crazy. Like for me, up until that point, it had been desktops, and you couldn't take your desktop around and do stuff. So like getting a MacBook Pro and feeling like, yeah, this is it. I can edit all of my stuff on this. And I did. I think you did too, right? We had MacBook Pros. Most people had MacBook Pros that, you would, by the third year of uni, you were using as standard, and you would go in and use the edit machines, from time to time, and to get people's feedback and stuff like that. Especially those little edit rooms, to have your little edit tutorials where you would sit down with some of the lecturers and they would watch your films, and yeah, it was like, it kind of blew my mind. But like you said, looking back now, like Final Cut 7 was quite restrictive, and like working, we've mentioned the 5Ds and obviously the frame rates and stuff. And back with Final Cut 7, I don't think you could have multiple frame rates on one timeline. So that was kind of and it definitely wasn't as easy as just right-clicking a clip and going modify settings and changing the frame rate of a clip. Like it was a big process. You had to take it out to other applications and bring it back. And yeah, it was a real hassle.
Yeah, I think it was quite restrictive. I mean, a little bit of my journey, my mom made a real sacrifice and bought me a MacBook going into university. It was like my, not coming from a rich background, it was like, Andy, we're investing in you, getting you a MacBook. I remember going to the Apple store in Ventura, no, not Ventura, the Galleria Mall in Fort Lauderdale at the Apple store, and getting it from there. It was because at the time the exchange rate was really 2 to 1, so your dollar would go a lot further than the pound. So I was really fortunate in that aspect. But yeah, you went to uni, and I knew it was one of the selling points, industry standard Apple equipment, and that was really good. But yeah, looking back, yeah, Final Cut was quite restrictive. I mean, you had to, any kind of change you made, any kind of tweak you made to the footage, it would mean you would have to render. And when we say render, it had a big unrendered blue background with big white text on your screen. You couldn't view it. I think now, like when in Premiere Pro, you can, you would have if you're using, say, Warp Stabilizer, for instance, if it's not stabilized, you would see a big strap of blue saying footage on, on render needs to be rendered, or I forget the name of the term, but you could still view it. In Final Cut, you couldn't view the footage at all. And yeah, the frame rates thing, you would have to go to a different program to get your footage to 25p. As the 5D at the times we were using, it was 30p that they only shot in before the massive firmware update of November 2009, sorry. And then you were able to, the game-changing firmware. But then the thing is
I can't believe you remember the date. The
yeah,
actual
I remember
date when it came out.
Because I bought a 7D because I did the 24p. Yeah. And then I sold it, and like once they announced it, I sold it and got 5D. But yeah, so any kind of tweak you would make, it was any kind of changes. But then it was Apple had obviously built the program around the QuickTime movie MOV files, right? Which is why when Apple ProRes came as a format, it was such a big deal, because you didn't really have to render it. Once it's already Apple ProRes, you drag it into Premiere and into Final Cut 7, and you could play it. You could make a slight change in the timeline and not need to be rendered. What people have to realize now, if you dragged your clip 2 frames back in Final Cut 7, you would have to re-render the whole timeline again just to watch it back. Yeah. It was crazy. But then having Apple...
And you know what as well? Like, saying that, I remember our films, like third-year films, I was having to render for like 3 hours. 3 hours to watch the film. And that's not even to export the film. Then there's a 3-hour export or something. So it was like... It was just when you got towards the end of your project, those minor tweaks were adding a lot of time onto your... You basically need to be finished with the edit a week in advance almost, so you could do those. I mean, I remember with you going to the media center, exporting, going to the screening room, screening the film, seeing the things that you'd got wrong or the sound wasn't quite right, going back, fixing it, doing another export. And it just took time. Like, yeah, I think like a week in advance of the hand-in dead date, just to make sure that your film was perfect for that screening, which is kind of insane when you think about that now.
Yeah,
all the hours wasted.
And you think of how we use it now, and like how you can make that little tweak to a program. You can make that little tweak. I shouldn't do, but I can do it. And it's not like I have to wait 3 hours to be able to review that clip. And I think that really allows your creativity to not have a limit, because when you're thinking in a way of, I have to have this done the week before just so I can render it to watch it back and export, or a few days before, I think that limits you a little bit. I know the other point of view is having a deadline is always king, because you get things done on time, and having a deadline focuses your brain to finish something. But like at the same time, if you just want to do a tweak, you're like, no, I can't. I'll leave it, and you'll let that tweak stay in your film, and then you're looking at your film on a massive screen, and you're thinking, that mistake's still there. I hate it. No one notices this, but I hate it. It's there, and I could have tweaked it, but it would have meant I'll miss the deadline for the render. So. But that Apple ProRes did change that a little bit, and that's why Apple ProRes became an industry standard, because it meant you could make a change in your timeline and you didn't have to render. Obviously, if you're like layering tons of videos on top, I think you'd still have to render. You did. Yeah, you definitely did. But it would mean it made things a little bit easier, which is why with the 5Ds that shot in the .mp4 H.264 codec format, we would then transcode all of the footage into Apple for ProRes 422 just so we could edit it. Because if you didn't, it was just basically uneditable at the time. Obviously, it's different now, but at the time,
it is different. But it's also ProRes is still a much nicer format to edit than H.264. Even today 100%. In edit programs, yes, of course you can edit H.264s all day long, but you still find that Apple ProRes footage, even in Premiere, runs smoother than a H.264 like all day long.
100%. I mean, I think like one of the selling points of these new M1 or M2 chip Max is that it has an H.264 encoder, so it can edit those footage much faster because there's a need there. it was never made as a capture format. And what I mean by capture, for some of our viewers, for filming the actual video, it was an H.264 was never designed to do that. H.264 was meant to be a delivery format for online use. You know, it's a highly compressed format. Don't ask me to explain the science behind it, but essentially it's like it uses the same compression as your JPEG pictures, and some frames where there's nothing happening, it'll be using a still frame it'll be using a still frame in that part of the image just to allow the file size to be smaller, because it says, hey, there's not much change in that part of the image, so I can make that a still frame for the next 30 seconds while the rest of the frame is moving. That's how H.264 works, and other things. Sorry if I butchered it to the super codec. The people who have had a doctorate in like codecs and stuff, but every frame, you know, but that's how it's allowed to, you know, compress, you know, HD quality footage into a fairly reasonable file size. Whereas ProRes, it's not thinking about the file size. ProRes is thinking about the ease of processing power with your computer and with the editing program. So it's much easier to edit, but the file sizes are much, much larger. But moving on from Premiere, sorry, I jumped ahead there. Moving on from Final Cut 7, what happened after Final Cut 7 for you, and what did you jump to or jump back to next?
So I don't remember the exact time. I think basically what happened is I was on Final Cut 7 until Apple released Final Cut X, Final Cut 10, Final Cut X, and I basically jumped ship after that back to Premiere Pro because I just wasn't keen on Final Cut X. I wasn't keen on the changes they'd made, and I think I wanted something more familiar. And I knew that Premiere had gone to like the subscription-based platform, which just made it way more affordable for like people, because back when Premiere was coming out, it was like, I think nearly $2,000 for Premiere Pro, or for maybe the Adobe collection. And then it was like a £600-700 upgrade every time you wanted to go from, like, back then it was like the jump from 5 to 6 and stuff like that. I don't remember exactly when it became CC. But I think basically around the time Final Cut X came out, because they were no longer going to be supporting Final Cut Studio 3, I think it was on back then, which was Final Cut 7.
I forget about all those other programs.
I went back to Premiere. Yeah, Motion and something else. I think Compressor, was another program that was part of the studio.
Never used it.
And yeah, so I went back to Premiere, and Premiere had just become it'd become way more like Final Cut. It wasn't that far away anyway in terms of layout and stuff, but it just felt like, to me it feels like Adobe were like, right, they've gone this direction, let's give all the people what they want. And it just it was updated way more often, so that stuff was getting fixed, files like were more usable and stuff, and it just became the kind of standard app. I know that some people went to Final Cut X and carried on with that. Me, I went back to Premiere Pro, and I've been on Premiere Pro ever since. So that's like, we're talking probably around, 12, 13 years now back on Premiere Pro. And I've just never looked back, really. It's kind of, it does everything that Final Cut did and more, and it's just so compatible with everything. But obviously there are some more contenders now. And, we talked about it briefly. DaVinci Resolve has now added in the editing part of its app, that was used for color grading, and I was using that for color grading, 10 years ago, using it for color grading, but now it's got this edit part, which is great, and it's free, and it's, I know a lot of people that aren't necessarily willing to pay the hefty subscription cost of Premiere because it's expensive. I know, and they get you because they give you a lot of apps, and if you use those apps, then you are obviously, that's how they get you in. But it is giving you a lot for your money. But DaVinci is free, right?
You know what? Just going back, I wanted to make this comment about Apple. As creatives, especially in the late 2000s, early 2010s, Apple really got a lot of mind share of what creatives thought they had to. We all thought we had to have an Apple to be an effective editor or creative in the film industry. There was that. I know people will say, "Oh no, you can edit on PC." I didn't learn to edit on a PC. Even my colleges had Macs. Everything that Steve Jobs and the team created, this ethos that like creatives work on Mac. And Final Cut Pro was like the epitome of that. You could edit on your laptop. I obviously, this is before my time in the industry. People used to have to edit on Avid machines that cost $50,000 just to do an online and offline edit. Whereas, you can edit on your laptop. That was Apple that made that. They brought that to the mainstream. I know PC, you could do that, but it wasn't as accessible and easy because of all the drivers that PCs had at the time. But they got greedy and they got arrogant. And some people might say, "Oh no, we don't agree with this because we use Final Cut Pro X." Final Cut Pro X was asking everybody to completely relearn how to edit. And it's like, how did Apple get to make the rules on, no, editing, nonlinear editing for the last 10, 15 years? No, we think that's wrong. We have a completely different way. If you want to use our program, you're going to have to learn this new way. And for me, it was like, all we needed Final Cut Pro to do better was able to take other people's footage in, so you didn't have to non-QuickTime MOV footage in without having to render it. Obviously, the H.264 files. Premiere Pro, at the time, I think CS5 was the first one I worked on. Or the CS6 was the first 64-bit program, which allowed us to just throw any kind of footage in there, and you could play it back. So you didn't have to transcode your 5D files. You didn't have to. You could even whack red files in. At the time, that was much harder to do. It was quite, for different reasons, because it was quite processor heavy. And Premiere allowed you to do that. And that's all we wanted Final Cut Pro 10 or 8, as it should have been called. That's all we wanted it to do. Look the same, but just not have to have a B30 but be 64-bit, which was the thing that we all wanted it to do, because once it became 64-bit, it would use more RAM. Thereby using more RAM, it could process things better. But they said, "Oh no, if you want to have the 64-bit version, you're going to have to completely relearn how to edit." So Adobe stepped in. And I remember making the move from Premiere, because the first production company I worked for, they used Premiere, but they were all on PC. So that was like an eye opener, like, "Oh wow, I didn't know you could do this on PC." It wasn't as widely said. And again, Apple took the mind share of our creative industry to be like, "Oh, you can only edit on our stuff." But yeah, Premiere, I know the subscription model gets a bad rep now, but we have to remember where we were before and what Adobe really offers you. Because After Effects, I didn't at uni, we didn't really learn much about After Effects because we were in an animation course. So it was kind of like seen as for animators. But then when you start to look at how powerful After Effects is, I think of people like Gareth Edwards doing like the animation for his films in his bedroom for Monsters famously. And, he did, a lot of it in After Effects. So After Effects was an industry standard / indie program. And that was also working in tandem with Premiere. So you would get all the access to that, as well as Photoshop. And we all used Photoshop anyway. So it really allowed the Creative Cloud when it came out. I think the Creative Cloud came out around 2012 or 11, around that time, for the subscription model. But it really changed. Obviously, those programs were available before in CS6 together as a suite. But the Creative Cloud was an idea, monthly subscription. In the long term, you will pay way more, but at least you can, look at your business turnover and actually say, right, okay, £50 a month is going to go out to this. This software is integral to my business. It's fine, as opposed to a $2,000 investment that is a big outlay at the beginning. And you could, I get that people are, I guess, but then, like you said, now there's other options out there. DaVinci Resolve.
Well, there is one option as well that we haven't talked about that I have used very briefly, and that's Avid. Because that was obviously the industry standard.
It was.
Right? Avid was the original industry standard. Yeah. And it's still widely used. And I have used that. I used that briefly in film school. And I could not get... It's not that I couldn't get on board with it. I just didn't want to. It works in a different way. The layout is relatively similar, but the way Avid works and what it wants you to do and the process it wants you to go through, there's benefits to it, absolutely. But I just wasn't, as someone coming from Premiere, I didn't like it. Avid works a lot more with like making sure that you have all the files in the right places and stuff like that. I think it basically so that if your project was to ever mess up, which sometimes Adobe, offline files and stuff like that can plague you, especially in the earlier versions of it. It's better now at reconnecting. But Avid was more kind of solid in terms of like, right, your files need to be here. They're going to stay there. That's where your files are. And I found it quite limiting to use Avid. And what I found was that, we would do the main edit in Avid for like my film A Bite to Eat, which is on YouTube. We did the majority of the editing in Avid, but then when it came to stuff like comping and any kind of effects, we would take it over to Adobe and we would, use Adobe because that worked with Photoshop and stuff like that. And it just played ball a little bit better. But Avid is one of those programs that kind of asks you, if you've never used it, then you are going to have to relearn. And that's fine because Avid is already an industry standard. The issue, I think, with the Apple and what they were asking you with Final Cut 10 is they were asking you to relearn something, but it wasn't an industry standard. And it's like, I'm not sure the industry is going to buy into this app either. So I'm not sure that I want to entirely relearn what I've done in order to work with this app. And I know that now Apple, it's a lot more widely used. There are people that swear by it. I'm not one of them. What you use is completely up to you. I'm just going to use the app that allows me to work as quick as I can and as effectively as I can, right? And it's like, you just get used to the stuff. I love that Adobe works with all of the Adobe apps, After Effects, Audition, all those apps that you can Photoshop. And it's just like, it makes it hard to kind of think about stepping away from that app now, which is, but for me, the fact that it integrates all of those things and it's just so flexible in terms of the formats that you use and stuff, I don't see myself stepping away from Adobe anytime soon. Having said that, I have used DaVinci to edit because I wanted to learn it, because it's like, I think it's good to learn new apps,
And you use it for color grading, and that's an extensive thing about it.
Yes, and also what happens is when you bring in your edit for the color grade, you might need to make a couple tweaks. So it kind of makes sense to learn it, but I find that Adobe feels like it's heavily built and modeled on Adobe DaVinci, because it's the layout and stuff, what the effects are called and things like that. And there is no reason that I probably couldn't use DaVinci as my main edit program from this day forth. It would just probably take me a little bit longer on projects to get things done, but there's no reason that, and considering that's a free program, I know there's some limitations with the free program, but it's when people ask me now, there's like actors and stuff, people that don't necessarily edit as them like one of their jobs, they ask, what program is a good one to use? And I tell them DaVinci, and they've never heard of it. And it shocks me that it's like, it's such a good program and it's completely free and it will get you by easily. Just go and download it. It's like, for anyone that's looking into getting into editing or trying to learn how to edit, DaVinci Resolve is the way to go, because it'll cost you nothing. If you learn it, those skills will be transferable to a Premiere Pro, maybe even Final Cut X, I'm not sure. But for me, it's a no-brainer. Like, DaVinci Resolve is insane for what you get.
I think, and also the thing is that it comes for free. The full program comes free if you buy any of their cameras, and or even like an ATEM Mini ISO. The thing, DaVinci, and I've had to play with it. I haven't spent tons of time in it. I love the idea of it, and it seems to work very well. It'll probably take maybe a week to relearn. There's a few quirks that are different. My only problem is that I'm so ingrained in the Adobe workflow that it's very hard for me to come out. And also, I use other programs of the Adobe Creative Cloud. I live in InDesign as a director, always pitching and using pitch documents. So I live in InDesign and Photoshop, right? You know, I'm not a graphic designer, more InDesign. Photoshop is, come on, everybody uses Photoshop. To get those two programs would still cost the full price of the Creative Cloud suite. So it's like, okay, I will, like, they're very clever because I think they do offer you maybe two programs for, but it's never the two you want. So for instance, if After Effects and Premiere were available, it still wouldn't be any use to me, as I would need InDesign and then Photoshop. So they've banked on you needing the wider creative suite because you're not just this one person that does edits and stuff, or you know, you're an editor slash graphic designer slash animator. And you know, for that cross, you might want to have Photoshop and After Effects to make your assets and then animate them. The problem is, you want to put music on it, you can do that in After Effects, but it's better in Premiere. So it's very clever. I wish it was £30 a month, not 51 as it is now. But again, I understand why people don't like the subscription model, but I have to think it's like, look, if you're looking at your business and you're looking at your monthly input, output, and your revenue, look, it is well worth it. It is the backbone of your business. However, DaVinci is great, and some of the things that they're doing with remote working, with the cloud store and the cloud Adobe, the Blackmagic Cloud, it is really, really clever and allows you to work well in a team. But it's like you have to make a decision of, we're going to all use this program now. Every collaborator I have, we're going to move to Blackmagic Design. The program looks fantastic. Some of the features look phenomenal. But, you know, we work together a lot, obviously. And it's like, we would both have to say no more Adobe and go to Blackmagic Design. And I'm just not willing to do that because of all the other things. So it's like, but the thing I'd also mention is competition is great for the consumer. It's great for us customers and users, because with no Final Cut Pro X, Final Cut Pro not really being a competitor, you could see for a few years, Adobe didn't really solve it. They were mailing in a little bit, you know. I felt, you know, we had crashing issues for years, which people still have crashing issues now, but they're not anywhere near what they used to be in like the early Creative Cloud days. I'm talking 2015, 16, that time. You know, you'd have to, you're stress saving your projects because you know it's going to crash. It's Adobe, it's going to crash. I don't think it crashes as much now, it still does. But then also some of the features that Blackmagic brought to the table, you know, really pushed Adobe to innovate more. And now some of the stuff they're doing, and as we're going to touch on this in a second, the future of it is really impressive. Some of the transcription models, the text, being able to remix your music track, making it shorter for you. It's phenomenal what you're doing, but it only comes when there's competition within that post-production space. And I couldn't tell you what Avid has done. I know they're going through a subscription-based model, but I couldn't tell you because it's like, well, Adobe does all this. If I want to leave the Adobe, I'm not thinking about Avid. I'm thinking about the Blackmagic Design. But that's only if Adobe stop innovating.
So what is the future? What is the future, do you think? Because, I mean, we've, like, obviously, like you talked about, text-based editing, so auto-transcribing your sequences and you being able to search within that sequence for that bit of text dialogue, and it'll take you to that bit in the edit. That's huge for big interviews and stuff like that. Massive. You've got like Adobe Podcast, which is obviously not an application right now, but probably not long until it's built into Premiere Pro, I'd imagine. You can work with Frame.io now. That's one of the latest updates, which is like a review website. So now certain cameras will automatically upload their clips to Frame.io, which then downloads the clips into the edit, also while you were shooting, providing you had quick enough internet, which we're all, we're going that way. Like, that's the future, right? Is that as things are being shot, they're automatically getting backed up into the edit, and the editor can start editing the day you were shooting, basically.
No, I think that's a great point. And I think as we're seeing AI, and we're not going to really go into that in this episode too much, because that future of AI, I mean, it's changing like every flipping week, to be perfectly honest. But like, just being able to have some of that built into your software, I feel that Adobe has really stepped up what they're trying to do to give value to the consumer. They're hearing the complaints online about it's too expensive, it crashes. They're hearing that. They're knowing that DaVinci's on their neck, and Blackmagic Design deserves that, because they're such an innovative, disruptive company that really wants to democratize, media production to everyone. And so it forces them to add the value in Frame.io. Overnight, I don't even use Vimeo review pages anymore, because Frame.io does a better job and is built in with 100 gig into your Creative Cloud. I'm sounding like an Adobe salesman right now, but like it's good. I understand it's expensive, but I'm happy to pay because of the value it gives me. But the future, I think we should say that for a future episode, because there's so many things that was happening right now. I think, when you start to look at a little bit of how other AI apps are going, Adobe is incorporating some of those features with image-based generation. But then also DaVinci, they may call it something, I think, called the Neural Engine. That's AI. They've been doing it. It's just called something else. So a lot of I think we can't be afraid of it. I think it's going to be a part and parcel of us, of our process. And again, text-based editing, you would say that's the way editing used to be, transcribed and whatever. I know there's going to be a question about jobs there. But look, we have to look at this as productivity is going to increase. Maybe your costs and your fees don't go down, but how much you do increases, how much you can output, how much you can offer to your clients.
Yeah.
Not to sound like a business podcast, sorry. I realized I've gone into producer Anderson there. But I mean, we're going to wrap it up shortly, but I think it's exciting, and I'm really excited about what we're doing. It's just being able to edit 6K footage on your laptop in the middle of the Scottish Highlands that you've just shot. Yeah. It's phenomenal, and 10 years ago would have been unthinkable. It would have been unthinkable.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not saying that any app is better. Find what app works for you. I don't want these apps to not exist. I'm glad that we've got Avid, we've got Final Cut X, we've got Premiere, DaVinci, because like you said, competition is good, right? It's just pushing all of these apps to go further. So the more apps that people are using, the better, because it means that we get more as consumers. So I mean, I think that basically wraps it up right now. So come back again, guys. Like, subscribe. Come back for the next one. We're going to be talking about Super 35 versus Full Frame. It's going to be exciting. And I'll catch you next time.
Take care, guys. Yes, like and subscribe. We're seeing your questions. Feel free to comment for other future subjects and things like that, guys. We're really excited about it. But like and subscribe our pages. Films by AW and Help I'm a Nerd. Subscribe to both of our pages to get all the content you need for the Help I'm a Camera Nerd podcast. I had to do my voiceover outro. All right, guys. Until the next time, see you and take care.